1865, Pennsylvania. The war had ended, but the echoes of gunfire and loss still lingered in the towns and fields. Families were rebuilding, towns were trying to recover, and life seemed to move on while memories of suffering remained. In one quiet town, nestled among rolling hills and narrow streets, a young man named Samuel Whitmore walked with a confidence that few could match. He was well known in the community, not just for his wealth but for his charm. People said he could persuade anyone to do anything, and he liked to prove it, often through reckless bets. Clara Thompson lived in the same town. She was just 18, the daughter of a local merchant family. Her life was orderly, predictable, and quiet. Spent helping her father with the shop and caring for her younger siblings. She was kind, gentle, and unaware of the attention she attracted from men like Samuel. Her soft brown eyes, calm demeanor, and natural grace drew admiration, but she remained innocent to the dangers of pride and cunning men. Samuel first noticed Clara at the summer fair. He was with friends, boasting about his abilities. When he saw her helping at the family stall, something in her calm presence caught his eye. But it was not affection, it was a challenge. He bet his friends that he could make any woman in the town marry him. They laughed, thinking he would fail. Samuel smiled, accepting the bet. It was not about love. It was about proving he could bend people to his will. Over the next months, Samuel carefully planned his approach. He attended every gathering where Clara would be, offering polite conversation and small gifts. He listened to her quietly, observing her routines, learning her thoughts and dreams. He appeared attentive and kind, but every word and gesture was calculated. Clara, naive and unused to such attention, felt flattered and safe. She did not suspect that Samuel's motives were rooted in pride and amusement. By October, the 6 months of the bet were nearly over. Samuel had orchestrated circumstances so that Clara would be inclined to accept him. During the town's autumn festival, under the glow of lanterns and the excitement of music, he asked for her hand. She said yes, believing he loved her. Samuel's friends were delighted, congratulating him quietly on winning. No one besides Samuel understood that Clara's heart had been manipulated for the sake of a wager. The wedding was modest but dignified. Clara's family, proud to see their daughter marry a man of means, did not question Samuel's sincerity. The ceremony was held in the small local church, candles flickering, the air crisp with autumn chill. Clara believed she had found a partner in life. Samuel believed he had proven his skill. Early married life was a delicate balance. Clara tended to her new home, performing daily duties and attempting to understand the man she had married. Samuel maintained appearances, showing charm in public while privately enjoying the knowledge of the bet. At times he felt a flicker of unease, an awareness that this was no longer a simple game. He tried to suppress it, brushing aside any hint of guilt with rationalizations. Clara began noticing small inconsistencies. Samuel's smile sometimes carried amusement that did not include her. His attention would drift at moments that should have felt intimate. At first, she attributed these to fatigue or distraction. Over time, however, she sensed something deeper, though she could not name it. There was a subtle shift in her perception, a quiet suspicion forming as the months passed. Samuel grew restless as the thrill of the wager faded. Winning the bet had given him satisfaction among friends, but the reality of a wife who was a real person, with hopes and feelings, was uncomfortable. He realized that manipulating Clara had consequences he had not considered. The charm he once wielded freely was now a burden, and small moments of conscience began to surface. Still, pride and habit dominated, preventing any immediate change. The townspeople remained oblivious. They saw a young couple, married and behaving as expected. Small whispers circulated about their interactions, but nothing significant reached Clara. Samuel's friends, aware of the wager, occasionally made remarks that seemed playful, but were cruel in their implications. These private jokes reminded Samuel that his victory was not innocent, and he sometimes noticed the weight of regret pressing at the edges of his mind, though he never admitted it to anyone. During the first year of marriage, Clara's hopes were tempered with uncertainty. She tried to believe in Samuel's care, but small signs of distance, inconsistency, and mild condescension eroded her trust. She had entered marriage believing in love, but she began to question whether the affection she felt was ever real. Samuel, meanwhile, navigated these changes with detachment. He understood the growing tension but remained unwilling to confront the consequences of his actions. Samuel's manipulation, once an exhilarating challenge, began to feel hollow. The bet had brought a momentary victory, but it had also created a chain of quiet suffering and mistrust. He could no longer ignore that Clara was a real person whose life he had affected irreversibly. The weight of the situation pressed on him, though he maintained a composed exterior. As months passed, Clara's perception sharpened. She noticed the subtle ways Samuel would redirect attention, how he measured his kindness, and the way he seemed more invested in appearances than in her well-being. Her heart, initially hopeful, now carried a quiet sadness. She could not yet articulate the depth of betrayal, but the unease grew steadily. Samuel occasionally felt pangs of guilt, but pride often overrode them. He could not admit that his actions, meant as a display of cunning, had real consequences. The first year of their marriage became a silent battle between perception and reality, between pride and emerging remorse. The town saw only a young couple, respectable and composed, but the truth simmered beneath the surface. By the end of this year, the stage was set for the unfolding tragedy. Samuel had won the bet, but at a cost he could not yet fully comprehend. Clara had begun sensing the truth, though she lacked the evidence to confront it. The seeds of regret, cruelty, and emotional suffering had been planted, poised to grow into the defining moments of both their lives. The small Pennsylvania town continued its quiet rhythm, unaware of the private storm brewing within one of its most talked-about households. Samuel's pride and Clara's innocence were on a collision course, driven by the consequences of a single reckless wager. The Whitmore household, once calm and orderly, began to carry a quiet tension that Clara could feel every day. Samuel maintained appearances outside the home, attending church, greeting neighbors, and smiling for the occasional visiting family. To the townspeople, he was the perfect husband, a man of charm, wealth, and respect. But behind closed doors, the truth was starkly different. Clara, now a year into her marriage, started noticing that Samuel's attention came in measured doses. At times he would praise her cooking, compliment her appearance, or display concern for household affairs, but there was always a weight behind the words. A careful calculation. She could not yet name it, but her intuition warned her that she had married a man who had never fully loved her. The first real shock came one autumn evening. Samuel had invited two of his closest friends from town for dinner. Clara had prepared the meal meticulously, hoping for a warm evening, perhaps a hint of affection in the quiet moments. Instead, she noticed the way Samuel leaned toward his friends, laughing at comments that excluded her, nodding in ways that seemed to reinforce his pride. She caught a brief smirk exchanged with one of them when her back was turned. Her chest tightened. Something was wrong. In the weeks that followed, small incidents continued to chip away at Clara's trust. A ledger Samuel kept, which she had discovered while tidying the study, contained meticulous notes about how he interacted with her, what gestures had been most effective, and even the exact phrases he had used to gain her favor. Though the ledger made no mention of the bet, its existence confirmed what Clara had begun to suspect. Samuel's actions had been planned, calculated and manipulative from the start. Samuel, however, remained outwardly calm. He noticed Clara's new wariness, the cautious way she moved about the house, the careful tone she used when speaking to him. Each glance carried scrutiny. Each question held a hidden demand for truth. For the first time, Samuel realized that control could not be absolute. Pride, which had driven the original wager, now sat uneasily with him, a reminder of consequences that he could neither fully hide nor undo. The social context of the town worked against Clara's ability to confront Samuel openly. Society expected young brides to accept their husband's authority without question. Gossip was cautious, appearances were sacred, and any open rebellion against a husband could ruin a woman's reputation. Clara felt trapped between knowledge and expectation, observing and calculating her response with the same careful attention that Samuel once used to manipulate her. The tension grew as winter approached. Samuel's private amusement at the bet, which had lingered as a secret triumph among friends, now weighed heavily on him. Each interaction with Clara reminded him that his victory had created an invisible wound. Her trust, once freely given, had hardened into vigilance. He could no longer charm his way through the household. The subtle cruelty of his initial wager had begun to manifest in ways he had never predicted. One particularly cold evening, Clara attempted to discuss a small household matter, a mislaid letter from a distant relative. Samuel responded with a tone that seemed polite on the surface but carried an undertone of mockery. Clara realized in that instant that nothing she said or did could fully reach him. His mind remained partly elsewhere, amused by memories of the wager, unaware of the emotional cost it had already exacted. The ledger continued to serve as silent proof of manipulation. Clara discovered notes detailing interactions with the townspeople, observations of her reactions, and reminders to himself of how he had won her over months. Each discovery reinforced a creeping sense of betrayal. Samuel had turned the most intimate human relationship into a game of strategy, and Clara now understood the depth of the deception. Samuel, aware that Clara had begun to perceive his manipulation, attempted to maintain appearances, but each gesture became heavier, more deliberate. Smiles were carefully timed, compliments measured, conversations rehearsed. The ease that had defined the first months of marriage was gone. For the first time, Samuel understood the emotional consequences of his arrogance. The bet that had seemed a trivial amusement had transformed into a lifelong burden, and the knowledge of his cruelty hovered over every interaction. Clara's response became increasingly cautious. She engaged in household duties with meticulous care, hosted neighbors when necessary, but avoided moments of intimacy or vulnerability with Samuel. Her awareness of manipulation made her measured in every action. The warmth and trust she once offered freely were replaced by quiet observation, subtle defiance, and an understanding that she must protect her own heart. The winter months magnified the household's silent tension. Days shortened, fires burned longer in the hearth, and every exchange carried weight. Samuel could no longer rely on charm or authority alone. Clara's perception had sharpened into an invisible shield that could not be breached by superficial affection. The dynamic between them had shifted completely. The husband who once controlled the courtship now faced the consequences of calculated cruelty. Historical context compounded the personal tragedy. The town still whispered about the Civil War, lost fathers and ruined homes. Samuel's actions were shielded by appearances, but Clara's emerging awareness mirrored the silent struggles of many women in the era, observant, cautious, and forced to navigate social constraints while discerning truth behind facades. Her suffering was quiet but profound, measured in small gestures, watchful eyes, and a heart learning to guard itself against deceit. Samuel noticed the change most during community events. Where once he could command admiration, he now felt the subtle distance in Clara's presence. Observers, unaware of the emotional undercurrent, saw a composed couple, but the undercurrent of suspicion and emotional caution between them was palpable to those who knew the nuances. Samuel's pride, once celebrated, now seemed to isolate him, highlighting the cost of his initial recklessness. Each evening, as Clara retired to her room, Samuel would remain by the fire, reflecting on the slow but undeniable consequences of his actions. The thrill of winning the bet had long faded, replaced by an awareness that he had not just deceived a woman, but reshaped the emotional fabric of his household. The subtle cruelty of his pride had taken root, and he could sense, though not fully confront, the weight of regret that would follow him for the rest of his life. Clara, meanwhile, began to document her own observations in quiet thought. Every calculated smile, every dismissive gesture, and every carefully chosen word from Samuel was noted in her mind, forming a clear picture of the man she had married. Though she spoke little, her awareness created a new equilibrium. She moved with caution, preserving dignity, while silently understanding the truth of their relationship. By the end of the second year, the Whitmore household had transformed. The superficial charm and public approval remained intact, but the private reality was defined by vigilance, suspicion, and emotional distance. Samuel's initial pride and reckless bet had yielded a hollow victory, while Clara's intuition and emerging awareness set the stage for the slow, inevitable unraveling of trust and intimacy. Winter had settled over the Whitmore household, and with it came an invisible chill that seemed to linger long after the fires had been lit. The town of Pennsylvania bustled outside, unaware of the quiet tension building inside one small home. Samuel Whitmore, once so confident in his charm and social mastery, now moved through his own house with an unspoken unease. Every glance from Clara, every measured step, reminded him that the game he had once played so lightly had begun to exact its toll. Clara's caution had become deliberate. She continued her daily tasks with care, cooking, cleaning, tending to household management, but each action was measured against the subtle ways Samuel's pride had imposed itself on their lives. She observed him carefully, noting how he spoke to friends, how he measured compliments, how he allowed small smiles to mask his arrogance. The woman who had once admired him now saw clearly the weight of control behind his charm. One evening, as Samuel returned from a meeting with town merchants, he attempted to engage Clara in casual conversation. His voice carried the familiar warmth that had once won her trust, but Clara had learned to recognize the patterns of manipulation. She responded politely but distantly, each word chosen to maintain civility while revealing nothing of her inner awareness. Samuel felt the shift immediately. The ease of command he had once enjoyed was gone, replaced by a subtle tension he could not navigate with charm alone. The small details that Clara observed had accumulated over months into a quiet resistance. Samuel's pride, once unchecked, now met subtle barriers at every turn. A misplaced gesture, a carefully timed question, or a hint of observation from Clara caused him to hesitate, forcing him to consider the consequences of the actions he had previously executed without thought. For the first time, he faced the reality that manipulating another human being carried consequences far beyond his control. Samuel's friends, unaware of the emotional distance forming between husband and wife, continued to celebrate the perceived success of the wager. They visited occasionally, sharing laughter that highlighted Samuel's previous triumph in winning Clara's hand. Yet in those moments, the contrast between public perception and private reality became more acute. Clara maintained her composed exterior, responding to greetings and pleasantries with measured politeness, while Samuel felt the invisible weight of a truth that could not be acknowledged openly. In the following weeks, Clara began to assert subtle boundaries within the household. Decisions that once flowed from Samuel's preferences were quietly redirected by her careful judgment. A household account, previously managed entirely by Samuel, was now reviewed and adjusted by Clara with precise attention. Samuel noticed, often with a flicker of irritation that he immediately masked, that his control over the household had begun to diminish. The very woman he had manipulated now exercised quiet authority through diligence, observation, and patience. An event in late January marked a turning point. A letter arrived from a distant relative, misaddressed and delayed in delivery. Clara, upon receiving it, chose to read its contents alone before presenting it to Samuel. The letter contained observations about the Whitmore household from relatives in another town, noting Samuel's public charm and his wife's calm composure. Clara saw in the letter a mirror of her own perception, Samuel's performance, admired outwardly, concealed the emotional distance and subtle cruelty of his actions. She quietly recognized the truth she had suspected all along. Samuel, sensing the shift in Clara's behavior, tried to maintain the illusion of ease. He continued gestures of apparent affection. A warm word, a polite compliment, a presence in the room meant to convey care, but Clara's vigilance rendered these gestures hollow. She observed him, noted inconsistencies, and adjusted her interactions accordingly. The man who once controlled the courtship now faced the consequences of his earlier pride and manipulation. The days that followed were filled with subtle tests. Samuel would attempt to guide conversations, insert compliments, or offer small gestures of thoughtfulness, each one meant to reaffirm the connection that had been broken by his own hands. Clara, fully aware, allowed him the appearance of control while quietly steering outcomes and measuring each response. Their interactions had become a delicate balance of observation, restraint, and unspoken negotiation. Samuel's arrogance, which had fueled the original wager, now clashed with the quiet power Clara had developed. Every carefully calculated move he made met resistance, not through confrontation, but through observation and subtle deflection. Clara's awareness and emotional restraint forced Samuel to confront, in ways he had never before experienced, the consequences of a relationship begun through manipulation rather than genuine affection. Even as the harsh Pennsylvania winter continued outside, the emotional climate of the Whitmore household had shifted. Samuel, despite public appearances, felt the increasing isolation that came from pride and prior cruelty. Clara's measured responses, her quiet defiance, and her growing independence left him with an awareness of loss he had never anticipated. The thrill of the wager, once so intoxicating, had vanished, replaced by the slow, undeniable weight of regret. Clara's actions were deliberate but subtle. She maintained kindness where necessary, civility where expected, and careful observation where danger lurked. Samuel's prior charm, which had seemed so powerful, now faltered against her composed awareness. Each day reinforced the lesson he had ignored in the months following the marriage. That manipulation could win immediate victories but could not secure genuine connection, trust, or respect. By midwinter, the distance between them had become pronounced. Samuel's moments of reflection grew longer, often spent staring into the fireplace, considering the consequences of his past pride. Clara, in contrast, carried out her daily life with quiet precision, her awareness a protective shield against further deception. The household, outwardly calm, held within it the persistent echo of the cruelty that had begun with a wager, now manifesting as subtle tension, unspoken observation, and the slow erosion of trust. Visitors, unaware of the emotional complexity inside the Whitmore home, continued to interact with Samuel and Clara as though nothing had changed. They praised the young couple, admired the apparent harmony, and marveled at Samuel's charm. To them, Clara's measured responses and Samuel's polite attentions were signs of an ideal union. Only within the walls of the household did the truth exist. A marriage begun in pride, sustained by calculation, and now strained by awareness, caution, and the first real taste of regret. The season pressed on, each day reinforcing the invisible boundaries Clara had established. Samuel, aware yet unable to fully address them, experienced the consequences of his prior actions more acutely. The pride that had once made him confident, daring, and reckless now weighed heavily, a constant reminder that emotional cruelty, even when subtle and unspoken, could never be erased. By the close of winter, the dynamic between husband and wife had transformed entirely. Samuel's control had diminished. Clara's awareness and quiet authority had grown. The household, though appearing orderly to outsiders, was defined by subtle resistance, calculated observation, and the slow, inescapable reality of regret. The consequences of a single reckless wager continued to unfold, shaping the lives, emotions, and future of both Samuel and Clara in ways neither could have anticipated when the bet was first made. Spring of 1867 arrived in Pennsylvania, carrying the first warmth after a long, unforgiving winter. Outside, the town seemed alive with renewal. Children ran along narrow streets, merchants reopened shops, and the fields were being prepared for planting. But inside the Whitmore household, the air remained dense, heavy with the consequences of actions that could no longer be unseen. Samuel moved through the house with the quiet pride of a man accustomed to command. Yet he felt the subtle chill of resistance in every glance Clara cast his way. His smile, once enough to charm and reassure, now drew only measured acknowledgement. Her demeanor, outwardly composed, carried an invisible weight that pressed against the confidence he had relied upon for so long. A ledger, hidden carefully in Samuel's study, documented the precision with which he had orchestrated interactions and behaviors, but its existence was no longer required to reveal the truth. Clara's observations had become instinctive. She noted the timing of his words, the way his hands lingered on certain gestures, the careful modulation of attention. Each detail was weighed, assessed, and remembered. She had learned to read the subtle cues that signaled both charm and manipulation. One afternoon, while reviewing household accounts, Clara discovered minor inconsistencies, receipts that suggested Samuel had misrepresented debts to local merchants, small favors extended to neighbors, not for mutual benefit but to bolster his social standing. Though each discrepancy was slight, the pattern was undeniable. Samuel's pride had extended into every aspect of their household, and she now understood the true cost of the wager he had won. Samuel noticed the shift immediately. Attempts at casual conversation met with polite distance, compliments returned with guarded acknowledgement, and gestures of attention were received with measured appraisal. The ease that had marked the first years of their marriage was gone. Each interaction carried a subtle tension, a negotiation of power neither openly declared nor publicly visible. The arrival of a visiting relative brought the household tension to the surface. The visitor commented on the orderliness of the home, the charm of Samuel's manner, and Clara's composed presence. Outwardly, the remarks were benign, but Clara noted the underlying implications. The careful observation of Samuel's behavior, the recognition of appearances versus private reality. Samuel's pride, once unshakable, wavered under the weight of recognition. Clara began to exercise quiet authority over daily life. Household routines previously dictated by Samuel were now guided subtly by her decisions. Samuel observed this shift with unease. Each small act of independence was a reminder that control could no longer be absolute. His pride had won him a victory in appearance, but the reality of emotional consequence was now undeniable. The days that followed were marked by subtle tests and minor confrontations. Samuel would propose a course of action, whether a household arrangement, a social visit, or a financial decision, expecting compliance. Clara, with composed restraint, would assess, question, or redirect the choice. Samuel, taken aback, recognized the growing gap between the man who once controlled every gesture and the woman whose awareness now guided outcomes without overt confrontation. Even minor interactions revealed the emotional shift. A discussion of community, events, or shared acquaintances now carried undertones of judgment and assessment. Samuel's attempts to assert authority were met with the quiet resistance of one who had learned to observe, measure, and respond with discretion. Each gesture intended to charm or cajole was subtly countered by Clara's discernment. The Whitmore household had become a place of invisible negotiation. Samuel's previous arrogance collided with Clara's emerging strength. Each day revealed the consequences of pride and manipulation. The thrill of the wager, once intoxicating, was replaced by a persistent tension that neither charm nor social approval could alleviate. Clara's awareness extended beyond the household. She observed neighbors and community members, noting behaviors that mirrored Samuel's own manipulations. She recognized patterns of pride, deceit, and social performance in the wider world, connecting them to the dynamics she now navigated at home. Her vigilance was not passive. It was deliberate. informed by knowledge of human behavior, and protective of both her dignity and her emotional well-being. Samuel, despite outward appearances, began to feel the psychological weight of the consequences. His attempts to regain subtle control, through compliments, orchestrated gestures, and careful timing, were met with resistance he could not easily counter. Each action reminded him that the human heart could not be fully commanded by cunning or pride. The emotional cost of his original wager had begun to manifest in ways that were inescapable. Social expectations continued to shape interactions. The town held women to standards of decorum and obedience, yet Clara navigated these constraints with intelligence. Outwardly compliant, inwardly discerning, she exercised authority subtly but effectively, ensuring that her awareness of manipulation shaped her actions without attracting public censure. Samuel's prior victories, now confined to appearances, carried a hollow weight in the private realm. Every gesture, word, and action within the household now carried amplified significance. Samuel's charm no longer masked the underlying consequences. Clara's vigilance ensured that each movement was considered and measured. The results of past pride, once abstract, were now concrete in the form of subtle resistance, emotional distance, and the first unmistakable echoes of regret. The tension of these months transformed the household's daily rhythm. Fires burned longer in the hearth. Conversations carried undertones of negotiation, and even routine tasks were imbued with subtle assessment. Samuel's previous dominance in decisions and actions was countered by Clara's careful observation. The dynamic that had defined their early marriage shifted. The woman who had once been unaware now guided the household through discretion and insight, while the man who had relied on charm and cunning faced the consequences of his pride. Spring pressed on, and with it came the invisible but undeniable presence of consequence. Samuel's actions were measured, constrained, and often halted by the awareness that his pride had fostered a distance he could not easily close. Clara's independence, quiet and deliberate, ensured that each interaction reinforced her understanding of past cruelty and emerging control over her own life. The household, though orderly to the public eye, now bore the weight of past actions in every subtle glance, measured word, and controlled gesture. The Whitmore home, once a stage for charm and manipulation, had transformed into a place where subtle resistance and consequence quietly dominated. Samuel's pride and arrogance, once celebrated, now faced persistent challenge. Clara's vigilance ensured that the cost of the wager, hidden from the community, would continue to shape every interaction, defining the emotional landscape of the marriage in ways that neither social approval nor public admiration could undo. By the summer of 1867, the Whitmore household had settled into a new, uneasy rhythm. To outsiders, it was orderly and calm. Samuel maintained the image of a respected, composed man, while Clara carried herself with the same polite decorum that had won the approval of neighbors and visitors. But inside the walls, a different reality unfolded, one shaped by pride, deceit, and the slow accumulation of consequences that neither Samuel nor Clara could fully ignore. Samuel, emboldened by the early success of his wager, had begun to escalate his control over the household. Small, deliberate acts of manipulation that had once been subtle, gestures now carried a sharper edge. He would question Clara's choices more pointedly, criticize minor lapses in household management, and use casual remarks to remind her of her dependence on his favor. Each act, though measured, carried the invisible weight of cruelty, a reminder that the initial wager had given him not just a wife, but leverage over her trust and freedom. Clara, however, had learned to navigate this increasing tension with precision. She anticipated his maneuvers, deflected unnecessary control, and responded to criticism with calm reasoning. Her composure was not resignation, it was resistance. The subtle cruelty that Samuel now wielded more openly met the growing awareness and intelligence of a woman who had been forced to observe, calculate, and protect herself. Every word he spoke was measured against her understanding of his character, and every gesture was quietly assessed for hidden intent. The first truly revealing confrontation came during a late afternoon discussion about household finances. Samuel attempted to redirect funds for a personal investment, confident that Clara would comply without question. She challenged him politely but firmly, citing both practical concerns and the hidden patterns of mismanagement she had observed over months. Samuel's initial surprise gave way to frustration, then to a quiet recognition that his control was slipping. The ledger, the careful observations, and the months of subtle resistance had transformed into an undeniable force, one that he could neither ignore nor fully dominate. The tension escalated further when neighbors visited unexpectedly, commenting on the household's order and the apparent harmony between husband and wife. Samuel, attempting to maintain appearances, smiled and directed conversation as he had been trained to do. Clara, however, observed not only his gestures, but also the reactions of the visitors, noting inconsistencies and subtle cues that revealed both pride and manipulation. The contrast between public perception and private reality deepened the moral weight of Samuel's actions, highlighting the invisible consequences of his original wager. In private moments, Samuel's cruelty took on new dimensions. He tested Clara's patience with calculated demands, emphasizing her dependence on his decisions and subtly undermining her confidence. Yet Clara, strengthened by months of careful observation and reflection, responded with measured resilience. She did not react impulsively, nor did she allow his attempts to dominate to succeed unnoticed. Each small act of defiance, though silent and restrained, chipped away at the authority he had once assumed as absolute. The emotional impact of these months became evident in the quiet evenings of the household. Clara would sit by the window, reflecting on the disparity between appearances and truth. Samuel, often in the same room, felt the persistent tension, a constant reminder of the moral cost of his pride. The thrill of conquest, which had once animated his every gesture, had been replaced by a slow, gnawing awareness that his actions were exacting a deeper toll than he had ever anticipated. The townspeople, oblivious to the internal dynamics, continued to admire the household's outward calm. They praised Samuel's management skills and Clara's composure, unaware that each act of admiration reinforced the invisible cruelty and resistance playing out behind closed doors. The moral weight of the wager, hidden from public view, pressed increasingly on Samuel's conscience. Every compliment, every subtle act of control, became both a reminder and a measure of the consequences he could not reverse. Clara's resistance was not passive. She implemented small but significant adjustments in household routines, redirected social interactions, and reinforced boundaries that Samuel had once assumed were entirely under his control. Her awareness created a new equilibrium, one in which subtle cruelty could not continue unchecked, and where moral consequence gradually asserted itself in the quiet, controlled way she had learned to wield. A particularly tense incident occurred when Samuel attempted to assert authority over a family decision regarding the care of an aging relative. His words, chosen to dominate, were met with Clara's calm but firm reasoning. She cited observations, historical context, and practical concerns, leaving little room for manipulation. Samuel, confronted by this combination of intellect and composure, felt the sharp sting of humility for the first time. The wager that had once given him dominance now exposed him to the full consequences of pride and moral misjudgment. The summer heat seemed to amplify the tension. Daily routines became battlegrounds for subtle influence, and each interaction carried the weight of past manipulation. Samuel's arrogance, which had driven the wager, collided with Clara's growing understanding of human behavior, creating a persistent moral and emotional friction. Every gesture he made was measured against the consequences of his past actions, and every decision was shadowed by the awareness that his cruelty had created resistance he could not erase. Letters from distant relatives, which once served to document social propriety, now offered indirect evidence of the imbalance within the household. Clara read each one with careful attention, noting how perceptions differed from reality, how pride and manipulation were often hidden behind polite words, and how the consequences of Samuel's actions extended beyond the immediate family. This historical context reinforced the moral stakes, deepening both her awareness and the emotional weight of their daily interactions. The subtle escalation reached a point where even the smallest gesture carried significance. A delayed smile, a measured compliment, a carefully timed question, each became a test of patience, perception, and emotional endurance. Samuel's manipulations, once easily executed, now met barriers he could neither predict nor fully control. Clara's composed vigilance created a constant, quiet check on the cruelty he wielded, forcing him to confront both immediate consequences and the long-term, moral impact of his pride. The household, though still outwardly calm, had become a place defined by tension, observation, and consequence. Samuel's initial victory in the wager had produced a hollow sense of pride, and the cumulative effect of subtle cruelty and calculated manipulation now shaped every interaction. Clara's awareness and quiet assertion ensured that moral consequence was inescapable, and that emotional resistance would continue to influence the balance of power. By the late summer of 1867, the Whitmore household had transformed into a place where appearances no longer reflected reality. Samuel maintained his public charm and social grace, attending gatherings and engaging neighbors with the same practiced composure that had once ensured admiration. Yet within the walls of his home, the consequences of his pride and cruelty had become impossible to ignore. Every word, every gesture, and every expectation he imposed was now met with the measured resistance of a wife who had long since understood the cost of his wager. Clara moved through her daily tasks with a precision born of observation and experience. Cooking, cleaning, and managing household accounts were no longer routine chores. They were instruments of awareness, tools through which she measured the actions and intentions of Samuel. Each interaction was deliberate, each response carefully calculated, and each observation quietly recorded in her mind. The woman who had once trusted blindly now guided the household with a subtle but undeniable authority. Samuel, confronted by the growing consequences of his actions, experienced a shift that was slow but profound. The thrill of the wager, the pride in his manipulation had long since faded, replaced by the constant awareness that his cruelty had generated a permanent emotional distance. He attempted gestures of reconciliation, a compliment, a polite inquiry, or a seemingly innocent act of kindness, but Clara's vigilance rendered them ineffective. The power he had assumed to wield so easily had become tenuous, and the moral weight of his actions pressed steadily upon him. The irreversible nature of these consequences became evident in a small but pivotal incident. Samuel attempted to assert control over the management of a family property, confident that his authority would be respected without question. Clara, however, had anticipated the move. She approached the matter with calm reasoning, citing facts, historical documentation, and practical concerns. Her response left no room for manipulation. Samuel realized that his ability to influence outcomes through pride alone had diminished. As the months progressed, the household atmosphere grew heavier with unspoken tension. Even casual conversation carried the weight of prior cruelty and ongoing resistance. Samuel's words, once instruments of persuasion, now felt hollow against Clara's composed assessments. The ledger that had once documented his calculated maneuvers was no longer necessary. The evidence of his actions existed in the patterns of daily life. In the quiet but deliberate ways Clara navigated each situation, Historical and social context continue to reinforce the emotional stakes. In 1867, societal expectations placed women in positions of limited authority, yet Clara's measured defiance operated within these constraints. She maintained decorum and politeness in public, while privately asserting control in ways that preserved her dignity. Samuel's manipulation, once celebrated among friends, now revealed itself as short-sighted and morally fraught, with consequences that could neither be hidden nor undone. The summer brought another subtle but significant test. A visiting neighbor, unaware of the household's private dynamics, remarked on Samuel's charm and Clara's composure. Their admiration, though intended as praise, only highlighted the discrepancy between public perception and private reality. Samuel's previous victories, which had been based on appearances and manipulation, now carried a hollow weight. Each compliment and act of social approval served as a reminder that the emotional and moral consequences of his actions had taken root irreversibly. Clara's internal awareness continued to shape the household. She implemented adjustments in routines, monitored interactions, and maintained careful oversight of financial and social matters. Her vigilance ensured that every act of manipulation Samuel attempted was met with subtle but effective resistance. The slow accumulation of these interventions underscored the permanent consequences of past cruelty. Samuel's pride had produced outcomes he could neither anticipate nor control. One evening, a discussion about the care of a relative revealed the full depth of emotional and moral consequence. Samuel proposed a course of action designed to reinforce his authority. But Clara, drawing on months of observation and reflection, responded with calm, logical reasoning. Her words carried the weight of understanding, experience, and moral clarity. Samuel, confronted with this quiet but unyielding authority, experienced a profound awareness of the impact of his previous actions. The wager that had seemed harmless and playful had produced irreversible changes, altering not only their relationship, but also his understanding of himself. Letters from distant family members and business associates, previously routine, now served as indirect testimony to the household's altered dynamics. They praised the outward calm and propriety, but could not account for the invisible tension, the careful negotiation of trust, and the emotional distance that had formed between husband and wife. Samuel recognized that appearances could no longer shield him from the weight of consequence. The subtle cruelty of the wager had set into motion forces that could not be undone. The psychological impact on Samuel deepened. Moments alone by the hearth, once filled with prideful reflection, now brought discomfort and introspection. He considered the choices that had led to this point: the wager, the calculated manipulation, the subtle acts of control, and realized that their effects were permanent. The woman he had attempted to dominate now moved with deliberate authority, and his pride, once his strength, had become a source of persistent moral and emotional tension. Even routine daily tasks became sites of subtle conflict. Samuel's attempts at control over meals, household chores, or social interactions were met with quiet but deliberate resistance. Clara's awareness transformed the ordinary into a measured reflection of consequence. Each minor act reinforced the permanence of past actions, each response underscored the moral cost of pride, and each gesture contributed to the slow erosion of the dominance Samuel had once assumed. The cumulative effect of these months was unmistakable. The Whitmore household, outwardly composed, now bore the weight of irrevocable consequence in every interaction. Samuel's pride had produced victories that were hollow, manipulations that were exposed, and emotional distances that could not be bridged. Clara's vigilance ensured that the subtle cruelty that had defined the early months of marriage could no longer operate unchecked, and that the moral and emotional cost of the wager would shape their lives permanently. As autumn settled over Pennsylvania in 1867, the Whitmore household carried a quiet heaviness that contrasted Sharply with the seasons turning leaves, outside the air was crisp, and fields once green now wore shades of gold and brown. Townspeople moved about their routines, their lives untouched, by the subtle turbulence hidden behind the walls of the Whitmore home. Within, every action, glance, and word bore the weight of months of unspoken tension, a testament to choices made and consequences endured. Samuel, once so confident in his charm and cleverness, had grown quieter. The pride that had driven him to orchestrate the wager now pressed upon him with a constant awareness he could not escape. His movements through the house were careful. He watched Clara more closely than before, noting the precision of her routines, the calm strength in her interactions, and the quiet assertion she exercised in every household decision. Each observation was a reminder of the power he had once assumed but could no longer wield fully. Clara moved with deliberate grace, her composure unaffected by his presence. She carried out daily tasks with precision, not for show but for understanding and balance. Her awareness of Samuel's manipulations had evolved into a subtle authority that shaped the household without confrontation. She understood the consequences of his pride, the moral cost of his wager, and the need to navigate her own life with intelligence, vigilance, and quiet determination. The distance between them was no longer marked by overt conflict, but by the persistent and unspoken awareness of past cruelty. The months had revealed the depth of irreversible change. Samuel's gestures, compliments, small acts of attention, attempts to charm were no longer effective. Clara received them with calm observation, her mind noting intent and weighing the meaning behind each action. The thrill of victory from the wager had dissipated, leaving a lingering regret that colored his every thought. The woman he had sought to manipulate now moved, with a quiet independence that underscored both the folly and the moral cost of his pride. Small incidents continued to mark the household with subtle tension. A misdelivered letter, a disagreement about accounts, or a minor household decision became tests of observation, patience, and judgment. Samuel approached, each with the awareness that his prior arrogance had consequences he could not fully reverse. Clara, in turn, navigated each situation with composed reasoning, ensuring that the household operated smoothly while asserting subtle checks on behavior rooted in pride and manipulation. The emotional landscape of the household had shifted irrevocably. Samuel, confronted by the limits of his control, experienced a growing sense of moral reflection. The wager that had seemed a clever display of charm and cunning now appeared as a decision that carried consequences far beyond what he had anticipated. Clara's calm authority, her ability to maintain dignity while asserting boundaries, and her quiet vigilance revealed the cost of cruelty and the inevitable presence of regret. Conversations between them, once easily steered by Samuel's charm, now required careful negotiation. He learned that words could no longer command compliance. Actions were scrutinized and intentions were weighed. Clara's subtle resistance had grown into an invisible framework that guided the household, ensuring fairness, stability, and the protection of her own dignity. Samuel's realization of this shift marked a slow but steady acknowledgement of the human cost of his prideful wager. Visitors to the household continued to see an image of harmony. Samuel's charm remained intact, and Clara's politeness and composure impressed neighbors and relatives alike. Yet beneath the surface, every gesture carried layers of observation and emotional calculation. Samuel's prior dominance was now tempered by awareness and consequence, while Clara's quiet authority ensured that the subtle cruelty he had employed could not operate unchecked. The household's outward appearance masked the enduring emotional and moral reality within. Letters, historical records, and interactions with friends and relatives further highlighted the permanence of change. The public perception of Samuel's success in the wager contrasted sharply with the private reality of tension, restraint, and moral reckoning. Each external compliment, each acknowledgement of Samuel's charm, became a reminder of the hidden cost of his pride. Clara's measured responses underscored the moral weight that accompanied their private life, ensuring that every interaction reflected the consequences of past choices. Samuel's reflection deepened as he considered the trajectory of the past 2 years. The wager, once a source of pride, had led to a chain of events that reshaped his understanding of human behavior, trust, and morality. He observed Clara's intelligence, patience, and resilience, recognizing the ways in which she had adapted and responded to his manipulations. The knowledge that his actions had inflicted subtle but lasting consequences brought with it a persistent regret, a recognition that charm and pride alone could not govern another's heart or spirit. Clara, aware of this introspection, continued to navigate their shared life with a careful balance of observation and discretion. She allowed Samuel the appearance of control when necessary, while ensuring that decisions and routines reflected fairness and awareness. Her actions, measured and deliberate, emphasized the lessons learned from months of subtle cruelty and manipulation. The moral and emotional consequences of the wager were fully embedded in the household's daily life, shaping interactions in ways both visible and invisible. As autumn progressed, the contrast between outward appearance and inward reality became increasingly pronounced. Samuel's charm remained admired, his public demeanor respected. Yet the quiet emotional distance between him and Clara underscored the lasting impact of his actions. The household operated smoothly, but the foundation had shifted. Trust, once assumed, was now cautious. Dominance, once taken for granted, was tempered by consequence, and pride, once celebrated, had become the source of deep and persistent reflection. Even minor acts carried symbolic weight. A carefully prepared meal, a measured word, a gesture of politeness or restraint. Each action reflected both the memory of past manipulation and the ongoing negotiation of trust and authority. Samuel learned that charm could no longer achieve immediate victories. Clara's awareness ensured that each interaction required honesty, observation, and moral consideration. The cumulative effect of these months had solidified the presence of regret as an enduring force within the household. In private, Samuel grappled with his own conscience. The lessons of pride, manipulation, and consequence were unavoidable. He reflected on the wager, the cruelty it entailed, and the irrevocable changes it had brought to their marriage. Clara's quiet authority, her vigilance, and her careful assertion of independence forced him to confront the human cost of his actions. He recognized that the charm and cunning that had once brought him success could not erase the subtle emotional damage nor the moral weight of his behavior. Clara, meanwhile, continued to balance observation with compassion. She had endured the consequences of Samuel's pride, yet she maintained dignity, patience, and careful oversight. Her vigilance allowed the household to function with grace while simultaneously ensuring that subtle cruelty could no longer dominate daily life. The moral and emotional lessons of the wager were etched into every interaction, shaping both their lives permanently. By the turn of the year, the Whitmore household had become a place defined by careful balance, awareness, and the weight of consequence. Samuel, humbled and reflective, recognized the limitations of pride and charm. Clara, steady and vigilant, ensured that fairness, dignity, and moral oversight guided each day. The events set in motion by the wager had produced an enduring awareness of human behavior, subtle cruelty, and the persistent presence of regret. The story of the Whitmores, hidden from public scrutiny, revealed the long shadows cast by pride and manipulation. Samuel's charm and initial victory could not undo the human cost of his actions, and Clara's quiet authority ensured that the consequences of subtle cruelty would shape their shared life indefinitely. The emotional and moral landscape of their marriage, once taken for granted, had been forever altered, leaving both husband and wife to navigate a reality defined by reflection, vigilance, and the